everyone. Lovely to be here today. I'm delighted to be talking about the concepts of affording environments today. So let's move on to the first slide. Today we're thinking about journeying outdoors and what's actually in an environment. It's important for us to recognise that actually outdoor environments matter. But more than that, it's important to think about what it is about the outdoors that helps children to feel as though they're part of an environment. What it is about the outdoors that opens up possibilities for learning, for planning out interests and working through theories. In early years, historically, we have celebrated the benefits of the outdoors, with the Macmillan sisters in Deptford talking about open space mattering. Frobo talking about climbing a tree is to discover a new world, and his development of kindergarten, gardens for children, which were designed around the sorts of interactions and conversations and explorations we can have outdoors. So the outdoors matters. But it's my job today to think about, if these things are happening outdoors, what can we do to actually incorporate some of that into more affording environments indoors? So it's about thinking about the possibilities and considering what's actually in an environment. Moving on to the policy context now. So we've got great policy in Scotland. I'm sure you agree. Realising the Ambition document is celebrated across the nations and internationally in some of the meetings that I've been at. Why? Because at the centre of realising the ambition, we put the children at the centre, and we're thinking about them, their experiences, their sense of place, and actually how to bring some of the child's environment outside of educational settings into the spaces they inhabit, whether that's learning outdoors or whether that's indoors. At the centre of realising the ambition, we're thinking about interactions, experiences, and spaces. We're considering professional noticing. And by that, I mean listening with your eyes, your ears, your heart. It's not just physically what you see, and using that in a professional way to make evidence-based decisions about the sorts of interactions, the sorts of experiences, and the sorts of spaces that you develop. This saying, being, belonging, becoming, is noted throughout our policy documentation. And this is something that internationally we talk about. It's important that a child feels they can be who they are within the outdoors and within indoor spaces. Research tells us that actually that sense of being is often maximised in the outdoors. Children have a freer sense to explore, to develop their own provocations, and actually, you know what, just to look forward and develop their own interests. And I think it's important, that sense of being, it's important that we use this idea of children being who they want to be indoors as well as outdoors. That sense of belonging comes from that. When a child feels safe, when a child feels as though actually they are free to make their own learning decisions, they feel as though they belong to a learning community. They feel as though actually within this space, they have aspirations to become who they want to be. They have aspirations to actually inform not only their own learning, but their own interactions and their own friendships and their own communication and regulation. So we're moving on to this whole idea of the role of noticing and adaptive professionals. Moving on to the next, great. So when we look back at the previous slide, at the heart of that is this idea that we as professionals have to be noticing and adaptive. What do we notice? We notice interactions, we notice engagement, we notice interests, we notice learning patterns and schemas. We notice provocations and the way that children interact with provocations. Our professional noticing matters when building environments, as it creates a space for children to belong and become. And that noticing goes beyond the kind of visual noticing of what they're doing. It's about reflexively understanding how to connect and build relationships with children, and how that in turn informs interactions, experiences, and spaces. So what I'm saying here is a noticing and adaptive professional will take what they notice on a social, emotional, intellectual, and physical sense, and they will use what they notice to inform the sorts of spaces they develop. After all, spaces should reflect the children within them. It should not just reflect the adult's voice. And we're moving on to the next slide. I've got 15 minutes to do this, and if anyone who knows me knows that 15 minutes is a tall order for me. It takes me that to actually say my name. So what is in an environment? We have a physical space. Yes, we have to recognise what's within a physical space. We have landform, we have light, dark, contrast, we have provocations, we have adaptability and loose parts with those endless possibilities for children taking their own schemas and their own working theories forward. But more than that, environments have emotional spaces, social spaces, and intellectual spaces. Research around the outdoors notes that actually the outdoors is a fantastic space to emotionally and socially notice how children feel, who they're interacting with, and what their learning interests actually are. Why is that? It may well be because it feels like a less curricular-led place. It may well be because children are different within the outdoor environments. But what we're asking you today to think about is, what do you notice about the physical, emotional, social and intellectual spaces outdoors and in? And how does that inform the evidence you gather and the next seizable, teachable moment that you have with individual children, or indeed with groups of children? So this takes us a wee bit to the theory of affordances. So Gibson was a perceptual psychologist. He talked about perception. He talked about the whole idea of what people see within environments. Now, he had this whole idea that within an environment, people went into an environment and they read the environment. They then acted upon the environment, and within that, they are modified by the environment, and the environment is actually modified by the interplay between the human and the environment. But within the theory of affordances, it's this whole idea of action possibilities. What can I do here? That's the question. And when you go to the next time you go outdoors, have a look and think, what can I do here? When we talk about Gibson's theory of affordances, he talks about things being movable, jumpable, climbable, and it's all action. In education, we've extended this idea of affordances, and we've taken it into the whole idea of social and emotional and intellectual affordances, knowing that actually environments have the potential to frame children as learners and to frame dispositions that they have towards learning and towards other learners and people within their classroom and their early years setting. But this whole interplay with the environment matters for us as educators, because we have realised and potential affordances. So we're moving on to the next slide. So if we look at an environment and think, what can I do here? As educators, we have to note what potential affordances are associated with the outdoors and eventually with the indoors. Then we have to consider what's been realised and why have certain opportunities, interactions and experiences been realised and why have some not. Here, relationships and relational pedagogy comes into play, because the sorts of cues that we give children in terms of our expectations of them as learners and as beings has an impact on what they realise and how they direct their learning within a space. So this idea that the environment is the third teacher, which comes from Reggio Emilia, is bound up with a theory of affordances and recognising that relationships, having shared meanings and understandings, and noticing what the children do, their interests, and how they want to interact within an environment, actually plays out in terms of realised learning. Moving on to the next slide. Anyone who knows me knows I love Claxton and Carr's work. This is comes from the theory of affordances, and it brings it straight into, right, what is in an environment? An environment is an ecosystem of relationships, experiences and emotions. It's actually less about that kind of tightly packed, scheduled learning that we sometimes see in terms of curricular directed interactions and learning. Claxton and Carr says that there's 4 different types of environment. And I think for us, what we have to consider is, how do we make environments expansive, powerful and potentiating for the children that are working within those spaces? Now, that means that we have to consider children's interests and notice what they're doing, notice when they're engaged and not engaged. Think about whether they're more engaged or less engaged outdoors than indoors and why that might be the case. And also consider the role of relationships within this and the way that their voice is listened to, reacted, the way you react to children's voice, and hear that and incorporate that into the sorts of environments that children want to work within. Moving on, I'm trying to be as quick as possible, Anne. At Strathclyde, we have developed something called the Strathclyde 3 domains approach. Now, this was developed at the beginning with our work in literacy, but we have now used this across the curriculum. And the basis of this work is this: a child's cultural and social capital has to be utilised and noticed and connected with within educational spaces. What do I mean by that? I mean their networks, I mean their families, I mean their interests and the knowledge that their families have. I actually mean here that all children's backgrounds, all children's funds of knowledge are assets. So instead of positioning children within environments as not knowing, they're assets. And in the outdoors, we often see the assets and an assets-based view of children. Now, if we do that, in terms of identity and agency, it grows. What do I mean by that? I mean, in terms of identity, children start to see themselves as learners. They start to notice other people seeing them as learners. And with this, they become empowered and they want to actually take their own learning forward. And it's at that point that the cognitive knowledge and skills can be spliced in, and we as educators can use our professional noticing to seize teachable moments in the outdoors and hopefully in the indoors too. So the Strathclyde domain model uses this negotiated environment, spaces, interactions and experiences, and unpacks each child's backpack, their interests, their knowledge, their working theories, and notices what these are and connects with them. And when we do that, as Claxton and Carr says, an environment becomes affording and potentiating. And I think we have our last slide. Maybe two more, sorry. I'm going to quickly go through this one and say that in early years, the early years is a really great place to actually connect with funds of knowledge. A great space to understand the lives that children lead outside of school. And by doing this, we unpack children's backpacks and they feel as though they belong and they want to become within the spaces that we develop. Right. So I think I'm going to finish off by just saying to you that professional noticing is key in terms of the environment. If parents, teachers and environments are all educators, then what we notice about families, what we notice about environments has to be capitalized to connect with the children that we are working with. And as adaptive and noticing professionals, we will notice with our eyes, our ears and our heart, and use this as the basis for building and co-constructing relationships, knowledge and learning within environments. And thank you very much.